Welcome, everybody. My name is Rachel Steidle, and I am with the Putnam County Library Friends in Cookeville, Tennessee. And we are honored to get to co-host an evening with Sarah Penner tonight in partnership with Humanities Tennessee and its chapter16.org literary website. First things first, I'd really like to thank Sarah for giving us the time tonight and sharing with us a little bit about her book. She's going to be discussing her novel, The Lost Apothecary. This novel was named the most anticipated of 2021 by Newsweek, Good Housekeeping, Hello Magazine, Oprah.com, Bustle, Popsugar, Betches, Sweet July, and GoodReads. It's also a March 2021 Indie Next pick and a #1 LibraryReads pick. So we just feel honored to have Sarah here today, and she's going to take a little bit of time first just to introduce herself and tell us about the inspiration for her book.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Awesome. So yes, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's always an honor, especially to be involved with events with libraries. I think when I look back at my childhood and when I fell in love with books and became a reader, that all happened at my local library, which is in Kansas, where I grew up. And I just think, like, what would I have done and what kind of reader would I have been if I hadn't had that available to me? So I'm always thrilled to talk with libraries and organizations like that. So like you said, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in as well. And what I want to do is just kind of start for about 10 minutes or so. I'm just going to talk through a little bit about myself, about the inspiration for The Lost Apothecary. The most common question I get is, what inspired you to write this book? So I'll definitely cover that. I'm going to talk through a couple of the resources that I used when researching the book. And then, let's see. Yeah, I've got some show and tell, so I'll show you some of those books. And then I think after that, we're going to open it up to questions. So definitely anyone who's watching on Facebook, feel free to drop your questions in. And we've got a couple moderators behind the scenes who are going to make sure that we get those. And I'm happy to answer whatever. So obviously, I'm Sarah Penner. I am tuning in tonight from St. Petersburg, Florida, where I live with my husband and our little miniature dachshund, Zoe. And we have lived here in Florida for about 5 years. I mentioned that I'm from Kansas. I grew up there. I lived in Kansas most of my adult life. And then again, just a few years ago, decided to quit 2 jobs, sell a beautiful home, and relocate down here to the South, and not too far from Tennessee. And we've been here ever since and absolutely love it. So I don't have a formal writing background. I actually have no education in writing or literature or English. I was a finance degree at the University of Kansas. And so that's very like left brain, critical thinking, analytical, numbers and analytics. And I worked in finance for 13 years. And about 5 or 6 years ago, just before I moved here to Florida, I kind of just had this like slight dissatisfaction with not necessarily my job. I always enjoyed working in finance, but I just kind of wanted something more. And for anyone who's read The Lost Apothecary, you know that one of the questions that Caroline asks herself in the story is about the difference between happiness and fulfillment. And I really wrote her character from my own experience, because when I was working in finance, I was happy. My bills were paid. I loved the people I worked with, but there was just something unfulfilled. So I did a little bit of soul searching, and I went to a fabulous workshop given by Elizabeth Gilbert. She's the author of Eat, Pray, Love. I'm sure everyone's heard of her, but she also had a book out at the time called Big Magic. And it's a book for creatives, whether that's art or music or writing. And she talks about fear and kind of managing the fear of rejection when you're undertaking a creative endeavor. So that presentation that she gave really resonated with me. And I decided, this was 2015, 2016, I decided that I was going to try to write a book. And I had always loved writing as a child. and I dabbled in poetry and journaling, and I'm sure it was all terrible. But I decided in my 20s that I wanted to try and write a book. So I did. I wrote a book while working full-time in finance, and it was ultimately rejected by more than 130 literary agents. So it was very clear to me that that book was going to go nowhere. It never made any ground. It was never published. So I'm not one to get too discouraged, and I decided I was going to write another book. And that second book is The Lost Apothecary. So again, while working full-time in finance, I spent about 14 months writing The Lost Apothecary, and lo and behold, 5 agents offered on it, which is really huge. For if we have any writers who are tuning in, a literary agent is your gatekeeper to the industry. And so to have 5 say that they want you on their team and they want to try and sell your book was a huge vote of confidence for me. So I signed with an agent in New York, and then several months later, we sold The Lost Apothecary overnight to HarperCollins. So a huge success story, very much like a Cinderella story, in that I experienced all of this rejection and then had a really good outcome with The Lost Apothecary, and it debuted at number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for 7 weeks. So just so many things that I never expected that have happened to me over the last 90 days that truly have been life-changing, because I quit my job in finance after 13 years. And that has been one of the most wonderful accomplishments of my life, something that I'm in my mid-30s now, and I never thought I would be able to resign from corporate America, this very safe and stable job. And now I'm a full-time writer. So it's been a very exciting path for me. So the idea for The Lost Apothecary, if we want to segue into that, I really knew from early on that I love this idea of an apothecary just on its own. So if you go to the bookstore and you look on the shelves for books about an apothecary, there's like almost nothing. But when you say the word apothecary to people, they're like, ooh, that feels witchy. That feels magical. That feels alluring. And I felt that way too when I started the story. I really wanted to develop this setting of this hidden apothecary shop in this dark, secret back alleyway in London. And I really wanted to put inside of this shop a very sinister woman. And so when I thought about what would make an apothecary sinister, my mind immediately went to poison, because that would be what she would naturally have in her shop anyways. So she's a poisoner, an apothecary, but I knew also that although she was a poisoner, I did not want her to be a villain. I wanted her in many ways to be a helper and a form of compassion and counsel to other women. So that was really where her story started to evolve. And she has built, Nella is the apothecary's name for anyone who has not read the story. And what I do over the course of the book is explain why she's running this shop of poisons, why she has her own source of vengeance and grief and pain, but then also why she helps other women take control over their own situations as well. And in that way is almost can be viewed as like a hero or a helper. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell. I'll show you a couple of quick resources that I used for anyone who's interested in knowing some of the things that I was researching when I wrote the book. And in case you don't catch the titles or the authors, that's not a big deal. On my website, I have under resources, there is a more comprehensive list. These books are included. So you can read all about, if you're looking for resources on Georgian London or poisons or apothecaries, it's all out there. So this first book is called Wicked Plants by Amy Stewart. And this is kind of a contemporary fun book. And it is about toxic plants, and some of which you may recognize from your own backyard or on the roadside. And she does all of these really beautiful. So this is an opium poppy. Yep, you can kind of see the drawings. I'm not used to like where to go on the screen, so that bear with me. But yeah, so this is a really fun book. And I think this would actually make a great gift for a gardener in your life, you know, with like some tea or a plant or something. But anyways, this was very helpful to learn about toxic plants, which there are many of in the Lost Apothecary. Another resource for anyone who's interested in knowing more about real life poisoning cases in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is Poisoned Lives by Catherine Watson. And again, this is nonfiction and is all about just real life cases. So I was able to kind of get an understanding of people who actually died from different poisons and how they were dispensed, how they fell victim, what sort of symptoms they had. And then this third one is The Secret Poisoner by Linda Stratman. And this is more centered around data. And she dives into different bills of mortality throughout the 19th and 20th century and talks about really just a lot of data, like who were the people who were poisoned, who were the people who were poisoning others. So just really good information. These two kind of together were very helpful. And then lastly, I'm asked all the time about mudlarking. So anyone who's not read the book, mudlarking it means scrounging around along a riverbed for interesting or historical artifacts. And it's a very common pastime in London. And I first heard about it when I got this book called London in Fragments by Ted Sandling. And in this book, he has all of these beautiful photos of things that he has found. It's kind of hard to show while mudlarking. And one of the things that I saw when I was looking at this book is this apothecary jar. It's a fragment of what he dates to the mid 17th century. And I remember looking at this and thinking, what if there was a clue or a last name or an address that I found while mudlarking on a little vial, and I realized it was connected to this unsolved murder mystery. And that's exactly what happens to Caroline in like chapter 2 of the story. So it's the inciting incident. It's her entry point into this mystery. And that all is a result of this thing known as mudlarking. And I did go mudlarking in summer of 2019. I did not, unfortunately, find an apothecary vial, which would have been really cool. But I found lots of pottery fragments and clay pipes and little pins and even some animal bones that I actually kind of threw back. I didn't bring those home with me. And if anyone's on Instagram, you can scroll to the very, very bottom of the page, like when I first had an Instagram account. And one of the things I showed was everything I found while I was mudlarking on the River Thames. So definitely once lockdowns are done, if anyone is in London and looking for something creative and fun to do, I would highly suggest getting a permit and going mudlarking. So that's kind of my spiel. So I don't know what questions have been coming in, and I'm sure that someone else is about to pop in, but if you have questions about anything I just covered or anything I didn't cover, if you have other questions that you want to know, I'm happy to answer them. So I will pause there and let Rachel take it away.
Well, I have just a personal question for you. A couple weeks ago, I was walking into Books A Million, and it was either the day or 2 days after I had finished your book. So it was very fresh on my mind. And I walk into Books A Million, and bam, your book is on the very front table in the very middle with like prime time spot. And I had a little fangirl moment. I'm not going to lie. I was really excited about just the fact that you were going to be with us and share with us. And it, made such a reaction in me. I wondered, how is she dealing with this? Like such a big change between putting your career in finance, now you're writing full time, and then bam, becoming a bestseller. How are you dealing with it all?
Yeah, that's a great question. It sort of varies each day. Some days I wake up and I'm just like, how do I do this another day? Because I have to write now every day. Like writing is my job. And some days I wake up and I don't want to write. And actually a lot of authors would say that, like, you don't many days want to create. It's a lot of mental effort. So some days I wake up and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to just be disciplined. I have to do what I need to do. I have to, manage the publicity and the admin and the email and the events. But then other days I wake up and I truly feel like the luckiest person in the world. And I will say there are more of those days, which is a good thing. So I when with the New York Times, that first week that it hit that list, like I had a physical reaction, like my entire body, when my editor called and told me that it was on the New York Times list, like my entire body went numb, basically, because I just couldn't. I was like, this is something people work their whole lives to achieve. And once you've earned it, you have it forever. Like I could never sell another book. I could never write another word, but I would always be a New York Times bestselling author. So that was such a cool achievement. And then when week 2 and week 3, and it just kept going. And I realized, like, wow, a lot of people actually like this book. It wasn't just a fluke. This wasn't just a lucky publicity thing. Like a lot of people are really into this book. So it wavers between like, this is surreal versus this is my new life. And I just kind of wake up every day and try to stay true to my roots. Like I grew up in a 2-bedroom log cabin in Kansas. I was raised very humble, taught to be grateful and say thank you and just work hard. And I try to really like root and ground myself in that and, not let it get to my head. And remember, just at the end of the day, like we all love books and I always have room to improve and do better. So that helps, just kind of like going back to where I came from.
Absolutely. Well, it seems to me like you're dealing with it all very well. And it's amazing to me, you shared in your intro that it took you 14 months to do the research and write the book. And I'm really curious, there's so much historical knowledge in the book and so much specific knowledge about tinctures and different things like that. What portion of that 14 months do you think was assigned to research versus like the actual writing portion?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say that the first that 14 months was mostly writing. I would say there was maybe a month or 2 months before that where I was just doing research and taking copious notes to kind of put myself in this world and taking notes on what was lining the shelves of this apothecary shop and what did apothecaries even do? Like what was a day in the life? I actually, on my bookshelf, I have a firsthand account of actually a male apothecary and midwife. And he talks about, literally, he records like on Monday, these are the patients that I saw. These are the drugs I dispensed to them. This is how much I charged. Then I went to the little corner shop and bought this. And it was written in like 1741. So it was very old. So I researched stuff like that to just kind of ground myself in what that life would have been like. And then the 14 months that I gave earlier, that would have been like actually after I actually started drafting the story. But I will say, when you're actually writing the story, you're inevitably going to stumble on roadblocks that you need to research. And you really have one of two options. Some historical fiction writers decide to research as they write, meaning they will hit that roadblock and then they will go to their resources and find what they need and then keep going. I think that is not best for me. I'm not very productive because you can go down these research rabbit holes for hours. So I have a habit of just putting in brackets what I need. Like if I need to know a specific wine they might have had at dinner, I will just in brackets do like wine, and I will come back to it down the road when I'm kind of in the mood for research or have the time to research, and then I'll pull open my stuff and I'll look at what kind of wine they might have had. So the research never really ends, but you have to be strategic about when you have the time to devote to fill in those gaps.
Absolutely. Along the research lines, and something you shared earlier was mudlarking. And it looks like we're getting a couple of questions over here about mudlarking coming in from the audience. And one of those is, what made you choose mudlarking as the way for the vial to be found versus, say, just walking into an antique store and discovering it there?
Yeah, so something I've noticed about myself is I like to do things that are sort of fresh and different and maybe a little bit rebellious as well. So if you look at a lot of dual timeline historical fiction, a lot of the present day narratives begin with the character going to grandma's attic or a library. And there's nothing wrong with that. One of my favorite books is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova, and that begins in a library, and she finds a clue that then sends her on this journey. But I knew I just wanted something different. I didn't want Caroline to go into an antique shop or an attic and find like a box with this perfect clue. I wanted it to be different. And so part of it was the Mudlarking, like this book, was just sort of percolating in my brain. And the other part of it was that I wanted a unique and fresh and original entry point into the story. And then the other part of it was that this apothecary's shop is full of vials. And I knew from reading about Mudlarking that all of this stuff that has existed in London for hundreds and thousands of years, it has to go somewhere. It goes in the trash or it goes in the river. So the remnants of the past are there. You just kind of have to go digging from them, almost from an archaeological perspective. So all of those things, I was just like, that's it. She's going to go mudlarking. She's going to go on a tour, just like I might do if I was in London, and she's going to find the vial, and that's going to be how it starts.
Awesome. You brought up in that the dual timeline. So duality seems to be a common theme in the book between past and present, healing medicine and poison, young and old characters who have relationships together. Was that also something, like, was there intent behind that when you started writing the book?
So I knew from the origination of the story idea that I wanted the story is titled The Lost Apothecary. And that has been the title since before I even wrote page one, like from the very beginning, that has been a title. And anytime you think about something that's lost, it's implied that that thing could be found. So that was in my head, but I knew that I wanted Nella and her apothecary shop and expertise to be so good and so strong that no one in her own lifetime could find out what she was doing and that she was the person running this shop. I knew that I wanted her secret and the truth of her shop to be discovered much later. So that kind of automatically created a second narrative, or this dual timeline that you just mentioned. But what just sort of came organically from that, once I had these two timelines, was this compare and contrast. And this is what's really fun for historical fiction writers who do dual timeline stories, is you get to show the reader what has changed between those two eras, but then what has stayed the same. So obviously Caroline's way of handling her betrayal and the chaos in her life, she decides that she's going to go back to school and separate from her spouse. That's much different than how people in 1791 would have handled their betrayal. So if in 1791, women could not they could not enter into contracts, they could not own property, they had no control over their own reproductive rights. There were so many things that they couldn't do, and their stability and their literally the food on their table was provided by their husband. It's not like that now. So I was able to kind of show how that's different. But then when we talk about what's the same between those eras, it's the betrayal, and it's just those human emotions that so long as humanity exists, we're going to hurt one another, and we're going to offend one another, and we're going to lie to one another. And that will go on 200 years from now and 1,000 years from now. So it was interesting to explore those different sides. And I would say it was pretty obvious to me early on that was low-hanging fruit for me. Like, that was an opportunity that I needed to carry through the book and kind of do that compare and contrast.
Well, and in that you created some really lovable characters, Eliza being one of those particularly. And so we have a question over here. Is there any hope for a sequel where perhaps we could learn a little bit more about Eliza's life after she jumps off the bridge?
Yes. So absolutely. It's not what I'm working on now, but I've always said from the moment I submitted the book, that there are certain doors that are purposely left open for Eliza. So book clubs always want to know, like, what really happened to her husband at the end, Tom Pepper, and what happened with her love story, and where is Nella, in this later passage at the end of the book. And I always tell people, like, if I wanted you to know, I could have resolved those questions with like one sentence. Like, I could have made it known what really happened and answered all those questions for you. So when an author leaves those open-ended questions at the end of the book, it's not an accident. Enough editors and copy editors read a story that those questions would be answered if they needed to be. So when you find that when you're reading fiction, it's kind of fun because you realize like the author is purposely leaving this either open to your interpretation as the reader. Maybe they envision a sequel, something along those lines. So with Eliza, I definitely envision like a whole different story for her. And what I mean by that is, I don't know if sequel is the right word, because it wouldn't necessarily even need to be read after the Lost Apothecary, but it would be taking Eliza as that character that everyone loves and kind of telling her love story and the little magic shop that she and Tom Pepper open and what really happens with his death. So not what I'm working on at present, but I think down the road I'll definitely revisit that.
Wonderful. I mean, speaking of Eliza, I feel like she kind of brought a coming of age feel to the story. And the whole book in and of itself really felt like it had some female empowerment aspects to it. I think that probably ties back to you showing the differences of what women can do in the past versus what women can do now. Is that something you see yourself continuing to do in your writing?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. I was just telling someone this last night, actually, that when you're a debut author, you're kind of in this interesting situation, particularly when your debut book has done really well, which The Lost Apothecary has. Your publisher and your readers and your new fan base that you've never had before in your life, they want something that's the same but different. And I know that sounds weird, but that's what they want. They want a story that feels like that author. They want the voice and the style and the pacing of The Lost Apothecary, but they want a totally different story. And that's a really challenging thing. And I've had to do a lot of thinking on like, what do I want my brand to be as an author? Thankfully, so many of the things that define The Lost Apothecary are elements that I want to continue writing and feel that are natural strengths for me. So, for example, you mentioned the female empowerment. 100%. I can say that with my next project and future projects, women will probably always be front and center. I am a woman. I just feel more comfortable talking about that experience. And it's just intriguing to me. So the female empowerment, definitely. I also really like writing fast-paced narratives with lots of cliffhangers and twists, almost kind of thriller-esque. And so my next project has that element as well. I'm really drawn to atmospheric historical settings. So my next project has that. And the last thing is in The Lost Apothecary, there's an element of speculative fiction, and that is via magical realism. So when we talk about speculative fiction, that means anytime that the characters or the reader are asking, did this happen, or was that imaginary or magic or illusion? It's kind of this like you aren't sure if it was real or not real. And magical realism is one way to do that. But there are other forms of prompting the reader and the characters to ask that question. So there's another form of speculative fiction in my next book that I'm not going to share, but I'm really excited to reveal when it's finally announced. But that's, I think, my brand that I've sort of defined for myself just informally is feminist historical thrillers. So we'll see how long that takes me and how far that goes.
Very nice. Kind of a more personal question here. I know you mentioned the library was a big part of your life growing up, and that you attended the library there in Kansas. What were some of your favorite childhood books?
Yeah, so I distinctly remember sobbing at Where the Red Fern Grows, which I think they have us read that in school, I think. And it's this terrible story with this, I think it was a dog dying at the end. And I don't know why they have children read that, because it's so I feel almost scarred from that. But I remember that one. But then on a more whimsical, kind of lighter note, I loved The Babysitter's Club. Okay. I loved Sweet Valley High. And I know Sweet Valley High, there's a ton of those books. And I sort of like my own form of GoodReads, because this would have been in the early 90s. I had this like long sheet of paper where I listed all the Sweet Valley High books and then like where I was at on reading to kind of keep track of them. So those were some of my favorites as a child.
Awesome. Awesome. Previously, you were talking about just writing historical fiction and picking different settings and everything. And what was it that made you choose 1700 London for this book?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions, actually, and things to talk about. So I mentioned, I think I mentioned, because this is my second event today, that I had written this first book that got rejected by 130 agents, and that book was also set in the late 1700s, and that was when King George III was on the throne. So it's known kind of informally as the Georgian era, and it was actually very scandalous. All sorts of brothels and the gin craze and police corruption. So I've always been really intrigued by this era, more so than the very popular like Victorian era or the Tudor era with the Boleyn sisters. So I had this base understanding of Georgian London from that first manuscript that I wrote that went nowhere. And so when I started writing The Lost Apothecary, I naturally thought, well, that's the era that I'm going to set the story in, because I'm comfortable in that. I know how people are getting around. I know what they're eating and drinking. I know what they're wearing. And I just felt like I had this foundation of knowledge for that era. But then this really serendipitous discovery happened as I was researching poisons, and some of those books that I showed you earlier with the different resources that I looked through. What I discovered was, and this is in the author's note or the historical note at the back of the book, but what I learned was that the ability to detect poison in human tissue during an autopsy did not exist until the 1850s, 1860s, so well after The Lost Apothecary took place, which meant that the late 1700s was a perfect era to set the story, because an apothecary like the one in my story could get away with her sinister behavior, and there wouldn't be like bodies turning up that had been poisoned that was detected through an autopsy, where police could realize they had a serial killer on their hands. And anyone who's read the story knows that ultimately what incriminates her is the vial, and their households are finding this vial with the same marking. So it's that incriminates her, not the results of autopsies. So that was a really serendipitous discovery that I just sort of loved this Georgian era anyways. But then to find out through my research that I'm convinced that poisoners were running their little hidden shops during that time frame anyways, was a really fun thing to stumble across.
Absolutely. And I could tell it was fun for you to write that. And you wrote those older, like the more historical crimes so well that it almost felt easier to condone those. Like it was okay, what the apothecary was doing, way back then. But then you shocked me a little bit with your present day crime, I think is probably a general or loose use of that word. But I was really shocked by, the potential poisoning of Caroline's husband. And were you hoping for that? Were you hoping to cause a shock in your readers by having like a present day crime element to it as well?
I knew that I wanted Caroline to be wrongly accused and find herself in hot water. And part of that is simply that the rule of storytelling is something has to happen to your character that needs to be dealt with. Like she couldn't just show up in London and, try and necessarily solve this crime without having also something hit a little closer to home and kind of more personal stakes. So I wanted something to happen to her that looked really incriminating. She's been taking notes on what she's discovering and different poisons. So that already looks bad enough, but then her husband that she's having issues with suddenly falls really deathly ill. That looks bad too. The route that I originally tried to take, just to give you a little bit of insight into a very early draft of the story, what I wanted to happen was I wanted her to have that first visit to the apothecary shop that she finds like underneath a building. I wanted her to have snagged a vial or some sort of jar from and stuffed it in her backpack and brought it home or brought it back to the hotel, and James ingests that and then gets very sick. But what I realized, unfortunately, this is an example of research working against me. There are no chemicals that maintain their toxic properties for 200 years. So everything at that point is like vinegar, tar, water. So I could not figure out how to get an actual poison from the apothecary's shop into that hotel room. So then I started down the path of essential oils and learned, much to my surprise, I had no idea, that eucalyptus oil it has killed children. Like that's not made up. That's not just some fictional thing that I pulled together. There are a number of recorded cases of kids, unfortunately, ingesting eucalyptus oil and having seizures and dying. And in adults, it causes seizures and vomiting and all of that. So that was my plan B, and that was what I ended up putting into the book. And what's funny is there's the Lost Apothecary was chosen for a number of subscription boxes. So these are like different companies that have subscribers, and they put together these beautiful boxes with the book and all these fun little accessories related to the book. And what they sent me, one of the boxes sent me like a complimentary box with all the stuff. And one of the things is this little vial of eucalyptus oil. And I'm like, this is poison. Like, this is literally poisonous. Not if you put it on your skin. That's how it's supposed to be used, and it's fine. But I just think it's really funny. It says warning for external use only. But I just think that's really funny that like, this is what James ingested that got him very sick. And if I had children, I would probably just throw this away. I would not keep this in my house. But yeah, it's just kind of funny.
The irony, yeah. And all of that research you had to do about the different chemicals and herbs and tinctures and everything, is that something you do personally? Do you grow any herbs, or do you use essential oils or anything along those lines in general life?
So to a degree, like in my backyard right now, I have basil and thyme and rosemary.
Some essential.
Yeah. So a few, but I don't have like a whole apothecary garden. I know there are some people who grow like actual poison gardens. I don't have that. In terms of essential oils, I have probably a dozen or so. I actually really like essential oils like tea tree oil. There's a recipe for a bug bite balm at the back of the Lost Apothecary that has tea tree oil. And when we moved to Florida, we realized the bugs here are bad. And I could not keep buying like all of this hydrocortisone and all of these expensive bug sprays. So I just went digging, like, how do I make my own? And the tea tree oil is like a miracle worker. The best itch relief I've ever found. And then tea, I love tea. I have a whole drawer of tea. So it's like, in some ways, I guess you could say I have a little bit of a home apothecary, but I certainly haven't gone quite as far as I know a lot of people have.
Fair enough. I'd like to backtrack a little bit. We have a question here about with your first book that you tried, and you said, what was it, 150 different places it was rejected from. At that point, did you ever consider self-publishing?
So I think I mentioned earlier that I'm a little bit of a rebel, and I kind of just like to do things my own way. And along with that, I'm also just very stubborn. And if anything, I kind of take rejection as a challenge. And instead of finding plan B or like another alternative, I'm more likely to be like, well, I'll just try again. I'll just keep trying. Like, I know what I want. What I wanted was to walk into a Barnes & Noble and see my book on a shelf. And while Barnes & Noble does publish a small selection of self-published titles, and many of my friends self-publish their titles, I just knew, for me personally, I wanted traditional publication. And so it was, of course, disheartening. Like, don't get me wrong, when those rejection after rejection came in, you have to do a little bit of licking your wounds and kind of pick yourself up, and that takes time. And there was a time of several months where I recall like not really writing. I just was kind of dealing with that internally. But when you have a goal and you have a passion and a drive for something, I think it takes a lot to say, you know what, I'm going to give up and try this other route. Instead, I was almost like kind of pissed off, and I'm like, no, I know I can do this. So I just kept trying and tried harder and tried to take the constructive criticism for why that first book didn't make any ground and incorporate that into my second story.
Awesome. Well, it seems to have worked out well for you. Another question we have coming in from the audience here is they want to know, who are some of your favorite authors?
Yes. So I have a new favorite author, and it's almost embarrassing that I just recently discovered her. But last month I watched on PBS the Ernest Hemingway special that's kind of been making the rounds. And he was a writer. Everyone knows he was a writer. And, but he had these, I never knew, like, he had these really fascinating wives, and a lot of them. He had a lot of women in his life. And I find that the women in his life are actually more interesting than Hemingway himself. So anyways, I immediately, when I was done with that documentary, I immediately started scouring the internet, like what historical fiction exists about Ernest Hemingway and his wives. And I think arguably the most well-known is Paula McLean. She's the author. So I started with The Paris Wife, which I remember many years ago was all over the New York Times bestseller lists. But at the time, I thought it just didn't seem very interesting. And I read it, I guess this was last month now, and I could not put it down. I was having like a visceral reaction to reading this book. I loved it so much. And then as soon as I was done with that, I picked up her other book about Hemingway's third wife, which is called Love and Ruin. And I'm reading that now and loving it. Another book that I recently read was Kate Quinn's title, The Rose Code, which is on the list right now. That's about 3 female code breakers during World War II at Bletchley Park. And I loved that one. And then just recently, I bought The Hour of the Witch by Chris Bogelian. So I'll probably start that next week. And The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams. She's an Australian author, but that's about the first Oxford English Dictionary and some of the words that were removed from it. So I'm excited to start that one as well. So a lot of historical fiction. That's really my favorite genre to read and to write, obviously.
All right, Sarah, it looks like we have time for one more question. And I am curious, if you could give one piece of advice to anybody that is an aspiring writer, what would that be?
Yes, I love that. So I've even thought about writing like an inspirational book, and it would be titled One Brave Thing. And what I mean by that is I think every day, and this isn't even just for writers, I think this is for all of us, no matter what profession we're working in. I think every day we should all challenge ourselves to do one brave thing. And it doesn't have to be a big deal. Like, it can be maybe sending an email that's just been sitting in our drafts that we're scared to send. Maybe we're making ourselves vulnerable by asking someone who we think has no interest in us for a favor or some coaching or some help. It can be raising your hand to ask a question. It can be answering a question that someone's been asking you that you don't really feel comfortable with. It could be so many things. Maybe signing up for a writing class. That was how I actually got started with writing, was I signed up for some online classes with Gotham NYC. If you just Google that, they'll come up. They have classes online. So it can be signing up for that. It can be asking a friend for a critique on maybe a short story. There are just so many things that take bravery, and that's why we're scared to do it. But I think if you just wake up each day and maybe even like keep a journal, kind of like a gratitude journal, but instead it's just a bravery journal, and just every day say, like, what's one brave thing that I can do today? And then you look back over the course of a month and you've done 30 brave things. I guarantee you that you will be further ahead in your goals or your drive or your passion than you were when that month started. So that's what I think, is we all just need to, and I have to tell myself this every day, like, I'm not fearless. There's so many things that I'm scared of, but I do try and approach things. And my mantra is just be brave, like, just do it. And, it's really paid off in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. I love that. I think that's wonderful advice. And like you said, not just for writers. I think that's something we can all certainly learn from and further our lives, like you said, from
Yeah.
taking small action every day. I think we are hitting up pretty close to time, though, and I want to just thank you again on behalf of Putnam County Library Friends and Humanities Tennessee. We so appreciate your time today, and I really enjoyed your book.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in. If anyone wants to know how to reach me, I'm not hard to find. I'm all over social media. I have a website. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, so definitely say hi. I do try and respond to most of the messages that come my way. So no one be shy. If you be brave and say hi. But thank you so much, Rachel, for having me on tonight.
Absolutely.